There is a moment after loss when sadness no longer explains what you're experiencing. You are not only grieving, you feel mentally unsteady, as if something inside you has shifted out of alignment. Thoughts arrive disorganized. Time feels distorted. Familiar places feel strangely unreal. You may even wonder if something is wrong with your mind. This reaction is more common than people admit. Loss does not only remove a person, it removes orientation. The mind was organized around a presence that is no longer there. When that presence disappears, cognition loses its reference point. You are not just missing someone. You are missing the structure that helped your thoughts settle. Stoic psychology helps name this without alarm. What you are experiencing is not madness. It is disorientation. The mind is responding to sudden absence the same way it responds to instability in the physical world, by scanning, looping, and searching for ground. This is why grief often feels unreal, why attention drifts, why the world seems slightly off. The mind is trying to recalibrate without the anchor it depended on. You are not failing to cope, you are reorganizing under pressure, and before healing begins, the mind must first register that something fundamental has changed. Loss is often described as an emotional wound, but its first impact is cognitive. Before the heart fully registers what has happened, the mind begins to fracture its sense of order. Thoughts lose continuity. Concentration weakens. Simple decisions feel unusually heavy. This is not because emotion is overwhelming reason, but because the structure that supported reason has been disrupted. The mind relies on continuity to feel safe. People we love become fixed points in our mental landscape. They help define what is predictable, meaningful, and real. When one of those fixed points vanishes, the mind experiences a kind of internal shock. Meaning collapses before emotion has time to organize itself. This is why grief often feels confusing rather than purely sad. You may feel detached from yourself, as if watching your life from a distance. The Stoics understood this reaction as a disturbance of judgment, not a failure of character. When the framework of meaning breaks, the mind searches urgently for coherence. Thoughts begin to loop because the mind is attempting repair. It revisits memories, conversations, and details not to torture you, but to rebuild a sense of order that suddenly disappeared. The emotional pain follows this mental disruption, not the other way around. Understanding this sequence matters. It explains why reassurance rarely helps early in grief. The mind is not looking for comfort yet, it is looking for structure. Until that structure begins to reform, emotional stability cannot return. What feels like mental collapse is actually the first stage of reorganization. The mind must acknowledge the loss before it can make sense of a world that no longer contains what it was built around. Stoicism approaches mental collapse with a question that feels uncomfortable, but clarifying: what did my inner world depend on? This question is not asked to assign blame. It is asked to reveal structure. The mind does not break randomly. It destabilizes when something it relied on is removed. Loss exposes the invisible architecture of your psychological life, the assumptions, routines, and emotional reference points that quietly held everything together. When one of those pillars disappears, the structure wavers. Stoic thinkers understood this deeply. They believed that the mind remains stable only when its foundation lies within what cannot be taken away. When stability is built around another person's presence, role, or continuity, loss becomes more than grief. It becomes collapse. This does not mean you loved incorrectly. It means your mind adapted around what felt permanent. Humans do this naturally. The danger is not attachment itself, but unexamined dependence. Mental breakdown after loss is not proof of fragility. It is proof of how central that person became to your sense of reality. The greater the integration, the greater the disruption when separation occurs. Stoicism does not ask you to undo love. It asks you to see clearly where your inner balance was placed. Once that placement is understood, the collapse stops feeling mysterious. It becomes intelligible, and what can be understood can be rebuilt, slowly, deliberately, and this time, on ground that remains even when everything else changes. Stoicism begins with a hard but stabilizing insight. The mind cannot remain steady if its balance depends on what it cannot control. This is not a moral judgment. It is a psychological observation. Stability borrowed from the outside world is always conditional, no matter how safe it feels while it lasts. The Stoics noticed that people do not suffer most when they lose pleasure, comfort, or even love. They suffer most when they lose what their inner order was built around. When a person becomes central to your emotional regulation, your sense of safety quietly relocates outside of you. Life feels calmer, clearer, and more coherent, not because uncertainty disappeared, but because it was shared. This shared stability feels natural. Humans are social by design. We orient around each other instinctively. The danger arises when this orientation becomes dependence without awareness. When another person becomes the psychological ground beneath your thoughts, their absence does not feel like loss. It feels like collapse. Stoicism did not warn against closeness. It warned against placing inner equilibrium on anything that can leave, change, or die. Not because loss is likely, but because it is inevitable. When that inevitability arrives, the mind reacts violently, not out of weakness, but because its foundation was removed. Understanding this reframes mental breakdown after loss. You were not too dependent, you were human. Your mind organized itself efficiently around what felt stable. Stoicism simply asks that stability eventually return home, where it cannot be taken away. This is not emotional detachment, it is psychological insurance. And until stability is reclaimed internally, the mind will continue to feel unmoored, searching for ground where it once stood without realizing it was standing on borrowed soil. Over time, someone you love can become more than a companion. They become a point of reference. Their presence steadies thought. Their reactions help regulate emotion. Their existence quietly confirms that the world is coherent and predictable. You do not notice this happening, because it feels like connection, not dependence. The mind adapts around what remains constant. When a person is consistently present, the brain begins to treat them as psychological ground. Decisions orient around them. Stress softens because someone else is there to absorb part of it. Identity stabilizes because it is mirrored and affirmed. This is not a flaw. It is efficiency. The mind conserves energy by building around what feels reliable. The problem emerges only when that ground disappears. When it does, the mind reacts as if the flaw has been removed. There is panic, confusion, and a sense of unreality, because the internal map no longer matches the external world. Stoicism explains this without judgment. The distress is proportional to the role the person played in your inner structure. If they were central, their loss feels catastrophic, not emotionally exaggerated, but structurally destabilizing. This is why reassurance often fails after loss. You are not looking for comfort. You are looking for footing. Until the mind finds new ground, everything feels uncertain. Recognizing this helps soften self-blame. You are not broken because you feel unsteady. You are unsteady because something you stood on is gone. And standing requires ground before it requires strength. When psychological ground disappears, the mind does not experience loss gradually. It experiences it as free fall. There is no sense of transition, only sudden absence. One moment, the inner world feels supported. The next, it feels suspended with nothing to push against. This is why loss feels physically alarming. The chest tightens, the stomach drops, breath becomes shallow. These are not metaphors. The nervous system reacts to loss the same way it reacts to falling, because internally, something essential has given way. Stoic psychology explains this reaction as the body responding to instability, not despair. The mind had oriented itself around a fixed presence. When that presence vanished, the internal map became inaccurate. The body sensed danger, not because death occurred, but because order collapsed. Free fall is terrifying because there is no resistance, no feedback, no confirmation that you are held. This is why people describe grief as unreal or endless. The mind has not yet located a new surface on which to land. Stoicism does not rush this moment. It recognizes that before rebuilding begins, the fall must be felt. Trying to think your way out of free fall only increases panic. Stability cannot be argued into existence. It must be re-established slowly through contact with what remains. Understanding this changes how you relate to the fear. You are not losing control. You are between supports. The sensation of falling is not a sign that you will never recover. It is a sign that the mind has not yet found new ground. And ground will return, not immediately and not in the same form. But once it does, the free fall ends, not because the loss disappeared, but because stability no longer depends on what is gone. After the initial shock of loss settles, a quieter rupture begins to surface. It is not always dramatic, but it is deeply unsettling. The question appears without warning, often in ordinary moments: who am I now? Not who was I to them, or who were we together, but but who exists in the space that remains. Loss fractures identity before emotion fully organizes itself. So much of who you were lived in relation. Your role, your habits, your sense of direction were shaped around another presence. When that presence is gone, the identity that depended on it loses coherence. You feel unfamiliar to yourself. This is why people describe grief as disorienting rather than purely painful. The self you inhabited no longer has context. Routines feel hollow, preferences feel uncertain. Even motivation feels unmoored. It is not that you disappeared. It is that the structure that defined you dissolved. Stoic psychology explains this calmly. Identity that relies on external roles is inherently fragile. When the role ends, the mind must reorganize. That reorganization feels like loss, but it is actually exposure. The parts of you that were quiet, deferred, or unnecessary within the relationship begin to surface. This phase feels empty because it lacks definition. But emptiness here is not absence. It is space. Space before a new configuration forms. The Stoics understood this as a necessary interval, not a failure. You are not lost. You are unconfigured. And while that state feels unstable, it is also the beginning of a self that no longer depends on what can disappear. When someone is lost, what dies with them is not only their presence, but a shared version of you. A self existed that only made sense in relation. Inside routines, private language, mutual expectations, and unspoken understanding. That self had a rhythm, a direction, and a future that felt assumed rather than imagined. Stoicism helps name this loss without dramatizing it. The shared self was real. It was a psychological structure created through repetition and trust. When the relationship ends, that structure does not fade gradually. It stops, and the mind must register that a way of being has ended permanently. This is why grief can feel like multiple losses stacked together. You are not only missing someone, you are missing who you were with them, the jokes that only existed there, the version of you that came alive in that dynamic. When that disappears, the mind experiences it as a kind of death. The Stoics understood that identity expands through association. We become larger in relationship, but also more dependent. When the association ends, contraction follows. The self feels smaller, not because you lost value, but because a shared extension was removed. This contraction is painful, but it is not damage, it is retraction. The self pulling back into itself after having extended outward for a long time. That retraction feels empty because it is unfamiliar. Grieving the shared self is necessary. Ignoring it keeps the mind searching for what no longer exists. Honoring it allows the mind to close one configuration before forming another. And only when the shared self is allowed to end does space open for a self that stands on its own, without denying what once was real. After loss, memory stops behaving like a record and starts behaving like a flood. Thoughts arrive without order. Images surface uninvited. Moments replay with a vividness that feels intrusive rather than nostalgic. The mind becomes crowded, yet strangely unproductive. You feel mentally exhausted without having done anything at all. Stoic psychology explains this as overload, not obsession. When a central figure is removed, the mind scrambles to preserve continuity. Memory activates excessively because it is trying to keep the structure alive. Each recollection is an attempt to stabilize identity, to remind the mind of who it was when things made sense. This is why memory feels relentless. It is not longing alone. It is the mind refusing to let the internal world collapse completely. The problem is that memory cannot replace presence. The more it is used to compensate, the more drained the mind becomes. Exhaustion follows because attention is split. Part of the mind lives in the past, maintaining what is gone. Another part tries to function in the present, which no longer fits the old structure. This division consumes enormous energy. The Stoics warned that dwelling where action is no longer possible weakens the mind, not because memory is wrong, but because attention has limits. When memory dominates, clarity dissolves. Mental exhaustion after loss is not weakness. It is the cost of holding two worlds at once. When the mind finally allows one world to close, energy slowly returns. Memory quiets, not because love faded, but because the mind no longer needs to work so hard to keep what is gone artificially alive. When someone is lost, the mind immediately begins searching for control. This search is not conscious, it is instinctive. Control to the brain equals safety. When something meaningful disappears without permission, the nervous system treats it as a threat that must be resolved. The problem is that loss offers no task. There is nothing to fix, no action that restores what was removed. Faced with this helplessness, the brain turns inward. It scans memory, replays events, analyzes conversations, and revisits decisions, hoping to locate a point where control could have been exercised. Stoicism understood this impulse well. The mind struggles most when it reaches for what lies outside its power. Loss exposes the limits of agency, and those limits feel intolerable at first. The looping thoughts are not irrational. They are attempts to regain leverage over a reality that no longer responds. This is why the mind feels restless after loss. Stillness offers no illusion of control. Thinking does. Even painful thinking feels preferable to powerlessness. The brain would rather hurt than feel helpless. Stoic wisdom does not shame this response. It redirects it. The Stoics taught that peace returns only when effort is withdrawn from what cannot be controlled and placed back onto what remains within reach. Until that shift occurs, the mind will continue to spin, mistaking activity for agency. Understanding this reframes mental looping. You are not losing your mind. Your mind is trying to protect you in the only way it knows how. Once it learns that control cannot be recovered through thought, it slowly releases its grip. When attention returns to the present, not as acceptance but as necessity, the search ends, and with it, the mental agitation that followed loss begins to soften. After loss, the mind convinces itself that thinking is a form of repair. Each replay feels purposeful, as if understanding every detail might stitch something back together. This is rumination, thought looping that pretends to heal while quietly deepening the wound. Stoic psychology makes a sharp distinction here. Reflection moves forward. Reflection asks, what can I learn? Rumination asks, how could this have been prevented? One accepts finality, the other resists it. Rumination feels necessary because it offers the illusion of progress. As long as the mind is working, it believes it is doing something useful, but there is no solution hidden in the past. The mind is searching a closed system for an outcome that no longer exists. This false repair exhausts the psyche. Each loop reactivates emotion without resolution. The nervous system stays alert, waiting for a breakthrough that never comes. What feels like engagement is actually stagnation. The Stoics warned that attention misapplied becomes self-harm, not because thought is dangerous, but because thought aimed at the impossible drains strength. Rumination keeps the loss alive by refusing to let the mind settle where reality already is. This does not stop through force. It stops when the mind recognizes that no amount of revisiting will restore control. When that recognition arrives, not as insight but as fatigue, rumination loses its energy. At that point, thought begins to slow. Silence returns not as emptiness but as relief. The mind realizes it can rest without solving what cannot be solved, and in that rest, repair begins, not by changing the past, but by releasing it. There is a point where thinking stops being an attempt to understand and becomes a way of inflicting pain. The mind revisits the same memories not to learn from them, but to punish itself with them. Every replay sharpens regret. Every detail becomes evidence. Thought turns against the thinker. Stoic psychology treats this shift with seriousness. The Stoics warned that the mind can become its own executioner when judgment loses accuracy. When loss is interpreted as personal failure, thinking no longer serves clarity, it serves condemnation. The mind becomes a courtroom with no defense and no verdict. This is why mental pain can feel unbearable. The suffering is no longer caused by the loss itself, but by the continuous internal attack. Each thought reopens the wound and blames the self for bleeding. What feels like responsibility is often cruelty disguised as accountability. The Stoics drew a firm line here. You are responsible for your actions, not for outcomes beyond your control. When thought ignores this boundary, it becomes harmful. It demands answers where none exist and assigns guilt where causality was shared, uncertain, or unavoidable. Recognizing this is not self-indulgence, it is discipline. Discipline means stopping the mind when it crosses from reflection into harm, not by silencing thought completely, but by refusing to participate in its abuse. When this boundary is restored, something changes. The mind no longer needs to hurt you to prove the loss mattered. Pain remains, but it stops being sharpened by accusation. Thought softens, space opens, and in that space the mind begins to recover, not by forgetting what was lost, but by ceasing to wound itself in the name of understanding. What makes loss feel mentally unbearable is not only what was taken, but what collapsed with it, meaning, the quiet sense that life was oriented toward something coherent. When someone central is lost, meaning does not simply weaken, it fractures. Stoic psychology explains that the mind needs orientation to function calmly. Meaning provides that orientation. It tells you why effort matters, why endurance is justified, why tomorrow makes sense. When meaning dissolves, not emotionally, but existentially. This is why loss feels mentally heavier than physical pain. Physical pain has a location. It hurts, but it does not confuse reality. Loss, by contrast, removes the narrative that held experience together. You wake up and nothing feels pointed anywhere. Motivation evaporates. Even small tasks feel pointless, not because you are depressed, but because the map is gone. The Stoics warned that when meaning is built around something external, it will eventually collapse. Not because the external thing was wrong, but because it was temporary. When that temporary structure falls, the mind is left without direction. This does not mean meaning cannot return. It means meaning must be rebuilt from within rather than restored from without. Until that rebuilding begins, the mind remains disoriented, searching for purpose where it no longer exists. Loss hurts mentally because it removes the why before it removes the who. And without a why, the mind does not know how to move forward. It stalls, it aches, it breaks open. Understanding this reframes the pain. You are not losing your mind, you are losing orientation. And orientation, once lost, must be reconstructed slowly, not through replacement but through redefinition. When meaning collapses, the mind enters a state it finds deeply distressing: aimlessness. There is movement, but no direction. Thought continues, but it no longer leads anywhere. Days are filled, yet they feel empty. The mind is active but unanswered. Stoic psychology describes this as loss of orientation rather than loss of strength. The mind evolved to move towards something: values, roles, futures, responsibilities. When the central point disappears, the mind keeps searching, circling the same questions without resolution. It is not broken. It is looking for a new axis. This is why people often feel restless after loss. Silence feels unbearable. Distraction feels necessary. The mind would rather be busy than directionless. Even pain feels preferable to emptiness, because pain still provides focus. The Stoics understood that orientation cannot be forced. It cannot be replaced immediately. Trying to rush meaning back into existence only deepens frustration. The mind must first accept that the old structure is gone. Until that acceptance settles, every attempt to move forward feels false. This period is uncomfortable because it strips away borrowed purpose. What remains is raw attention, waiting for something stable to organize around. Many mistake this for collapse. It is actually clearing. Without orientation, the mind feels exposed, but exposure is not destruction. It is the removal of scaffolding that no longer fits. When the mind stops demanding immediate direction, something quieter begins to emerge. The capacity to build meaning that does not depend on what can vanish. This stage cannot be skipped. It must be endured gently. And though it feels empty, it is the space in which a more durable inner structure begins to take shape. Stoicism never promised freedom from pain. It promised freedom from collapse. The distinction matters, especially in loss. Collapse happens when pain is interpreted as proof that something is wrong with you, that you are unable to endure what life has demanded. Stoicism rejects this interpretation. The Stoics believed endurance was not about resisting pain, but about remaining intact while it passes. To endure meant to stay aligned with reality without surrendering judgment to despair. Pain was expected. Disorientation was expected. What mattered was not eliminating them, but not allowing them to define the self. Loss tests this principle deeply. When meaning fractures and orientation dissolves, the temptation is to believe that mental suffering signals weakness. Stoicism reframes this entirely. Mental pain is not evidence of fragility. It is evidence of depth. Only minds that were fully engaged with life experience this level of disruption when something central is removed. Endurance, then, is not stoic silence or forced composure. It is the willingness to remain present without rushing to escape discomfort. It is allowing the mind to feel broken without concluding that it is broken forever. The Stoics taught that collapse occurs when judgment adds catastrophe to pain, when suffering is interpreted as permanent, unbearable, or identity-defining. Endurance interrupts that judgment. It says this is heavy, but it is not final. By holding this distinction, the mind begins to stabilize, not because the loss has been resolved, but because despair no longer governs interpretation. Pain remains, but it is carried rather than amplified. This is Stoic strength at its most human, not in vulnerability but continuity, the capacity to remain oneself while the world rearranges. And from that continuity, rebuilding becomes possible, slowly, without denial, and without losing the self in the process. After loss, the mind instinctively wants answers. Why did this happen? What does it mean? How do I move forward? But Stoic psychology places something more important before understanding stabilization. A mind that is unsteady cannot integrate insight. It can only spin. The Stoics understood that when the inner world is shaken, clarity must wait. Before meaning can be rebuilt, the nervous system must first regain a sense of ground. This is why early grief feels chaotic. The mind is trying to think its way out of a state that requires settling, not solving. Stabilization is not intellectual. It happens through contact with what is still present and reliable. Breath that returns again and again. The body sitting in a chair. The repetition of simple routines. These are not distractions. They are signals to the mind that not everything has collapsed. Stoicism emphasized anchoring attention to what is within immediate control, not to escape pain, but to prevent disintegration. When attention rests on what remains stable, the mind slowly stops scanning for catastrophe. Thought loses urgency. Space opens. Understanding will come later. Meaning will reform later. But if the mind is forced to interpret before it is stable, interpretation turns cruel. Stabilization protects the mind from its own desperation. This is why Stoic endurance begins quietly, not with insight, but with presence, not with explanation, but with grounding. When stability returns, even partially, the mind becomes capable of understanding without breaking itself in the process. Once the mind has stabilized, it begins to ask a different question, not why did this happen, but where does meaning live now? This is a quieter inquiry, less urgent, less desperate. It does not search for replacement. It searches for return. Stoic psychology insists that meaning borrowed from outside the self is always provisional. When someone is lost, meaning collapses because it was located where it could be removed. Returning meaning to the self does not mean rejecting connection. It means restoring authorship. This return is subtle. Meaning does not arrive as inspiration or purpose. It reappears as small acts of alignment, acting with integrity when no one is watching, keeping commitments that no longer depend on shared plans, choosing what is right, not what is comforting. The Stoics believed that meaning is generated through virtue, not circumstance. Virtue in this sense is not moral rigidity. It is coherence between thought, action, and values. When life loses its outer structure, this inner coherence becomes the only stable source of direction. Returning meaning to the self feels quiet, because it does not rely on excitement or hope. It relies on steadiness. The mind begins to recognize that while much was lost, the capacity to choose, to value, and to act remains untouched. This recognition does not erase grief. It contextualizes it. Loss no longer defines the entirety of existence. Meaning begins to form around what cannot be taken: character, judgment, and the ability to meet reality without surrendering oneself. As meaning returns inward, the mind regains orientation. Not toward what was, but toward what is possible now. And in that reorientation, the sense of mental fracture slowly gives way to continuity again. The mind does not rebuild itself through force or insight alone. It rebuilds through time, repetition, and patience. After loss, there is a temptation to accelerate recovery, to get back to normal, to understand everything quickly, to feel whole again as soon as possible. Stoic psychology warns against this urgency. Reconstruction is gradual because the mind is learning a new configuration. Old pathways no longer apply. New ones must form without being rushed into shape. When the mind is pressured to resolve too quickly, it resists. Healing becomes another demand rather than a natural process. Letting the mind rebuild slowly means allowing uneven days, moments of clarity followed by confusion, calm followed by grief. This fluctuation is not failure. It is integration happening in layers. Each return to present strengthens the new structure quietly. The Stoics understood that growth occurs through consistency, not intensity. Small, stable actions repeated over time create resilience that cannot be shaken easily. The mind learns again how to trust continuity, not in people or outcomes, but in its own capacity to adapt. As rebuilding continues, the sense of fracture fades, not because the loss disappears, but because it is no longer carrying the entire structure of meaning alone. The mind regains flexibility. Thought becomes less sharp. This is how wholeness returns. Not suddenly, and not completely as before. It returns as durability. A mind that has been broken open and reassembled with awareness does not become fragile. It becomes grounded, and grounded minds, once rebuilt, do not shatter as easily again. One of the most damaging conclusions the mind reaches after loss is that it has been permanently damaged, that something essential has failed. Stoic psychology rejects this interpretation entirely. What feels like breakdown is, in truth, reorganization under extreme pressure. The mind reorganizes when circumstances demand it. Loss removes structures that once held meaning in place. The confusion, instability, and exhaustion that follow are not signs of weakness. They are signs that the mind is adapting to a reality that no longer fits its previous shape. The Stoics believe that human beings are not fragile by nature. They are adaptive. Mental pain does not signal collapse unless judgment declares it so. When pain is allowed without catastrophic interpretation, the self remains intact beneath it. You are not losing yourself. You are shedding a configuration that can no longer function. That process feels disorienting because it removes what was familiar before something new has formed. Understanding this restores dignity to suffering. You are not defective for struggling. You are responding to loss in the only way a conscious mind can, by rearranging itself around what remains. When this is seen clearly, self-judgment softens. The question changes from, "What's wrong with me?" to, "What is being reformed?" And that shift alone brings stability back into reach. Loss leaves a mark, but a mark is not a ruin. Stoicism does not promise that you will return to who you were before. It offers something more honest: continuity through change. The self that emerges after loss is not diminished. It is altered. Change feels threatening because it breaks familiarity, but destruction implies absence. You are still here, still thinking, still choosing, still capable of meaning. What has changed is the arrangement of what matters. The Stoics believe that life reshapes character through adversity, not by erasing joy but by deepening discernment. Loss narrows illusions. It clarifies what can be depended on and what cannot. In that clarity, resilience grows quietly. You may never think the same way again. That is not failure. That is learning integrated at the deepest level. The mind that has endured loss without abandoning itself becomes less reliant on external stability and more grounded in inner coherence. This is not triumph. It is maturity. A calm recognition that pain can pass through without defining the whole of who you are. Loss did not destroy you. It rearranged you. And what remains is not weaker but more rooted. From this place life continues, not as a return to the past, but as a steadier movement forward, shaped by understanding rather than fear.